If the Confederates had marched on Washington after Bull Run, and if the Confederates had purchased the East India Company's fleet in 1861. By Joseph Edgar Chamberlin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1. If the Confederates had marched on Washington after Bull Run. There had been a great many attempts to excuse or minimize the failure of General Joseph E. Johnston to follow up on the tremendous Confederate victory won by his second-in-command, General G.T. Beauregard, at Bull Run, July 21, 1861. That the Federal Army was beaten literally to a pulp, there can be no doubt. General Irwin McDowell, who commanded the Union forces, officially reported after the battle that all his troops were in flight, in a state of utter disorganization. They could not, he wired on July 22nd, be prepared for action by tomorrow morning, even if they were willing. The larger part of the men are a confused mob, entirely demoralized. They were actually running away in such a state of panic that they could not get away, for commissary and ammunition wagons, congressmen's and other spectators' horses and carriages, artillery and sutlers' wagons were blocking the road, and panic-stricken soldiers were falling over one another. When General McClellan had come to take command after McDowell had been superseded, he reported this state of affairs. I found no army to command. A mere collection of regiments cowering on the banks of the Potomac. Some perfectly raw, others dispirited by defeat. To reach the spot where the beaten raw recruits were thus cowering, General Johnson and General Beauregard had only to advance 20 miles, over a road every foot of which was well known to them. That the Federal Army was in ignominious flight they were well aware, for they reported it joyfully to the government at Richmond. Why did they settle down into utter inaction, and allow McClellan to fortify the capital and organize, drill, and inspire with hope and confidence a great army? There are a good many ifs in connection with the actual fighting of the Battle of Bull Run. But this if that comes after it, if the elated and triumphant Confederate army had immediately advanced to the Potomac, invested the entrenchments at Arlington Heights, and very likely effected a crossing above or near the great falls of the river, and flanked the capital of the Union, is the greatest and most interesting of them all. General Beauregard actually commanded at the battle on the 21st, because General Johnston, who ranked him, had but just arrived on the scene and was unfamiliar with the ground and the disposition of the troops. But he, Johnston, became responsible for the further prosecution of the campaign, once the battle was won. It was in large measure his fault that the fruits of victory were not reaped. The commonly accepted explanation of the matter is that the Confederates were almost as much disorganized by victory as the Federals were by defeat. That they had no fresh troops, and no cavalry with which to pursue, and that Arlington Heights were too well fortified to be attacked. But General Beauregard, sore at the attempt to rob him of the laurels of victory, has been able to show that all of the Confederate brigades of Ewell, Holmes, D.R. Jones, and Longstreet, and 2 regiments of Bonham's brigade, were perfectly fresh and unharmed after the fight. That Early's brigade had hardly been under fire. That new regiments had come up during the day. That the fresh troops in all numbered at least 15,000. That more than half the Confederate army, in fact, had not been engaged. A very unusual proportion after an important battle. The remaining forces, after a night's rest, says Beauregard himself, would have been instantly reorganized and found thoroughly safe to join the advance. Apparently nothing but shame on the northern side, and an unwillingness on the southern side to discredit their great generals, has prevented a full acknowledgment of the fatal tactics which prevented an advance on the Potomac after Bull Run. Now let us see what would have resulted from a Confederate investment of Washington in the summer of 1861. Federal troops had already been attacked in the streets of Baltimore. That city was preponderantly disloyal, and had to be garrisoned with Union troops. Missouri had not yet been won to the Union. Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, all of which were necessary to the maintenance of the northern position, were slave states, and their loyalty was doubtful. If the capital of the Union had been taken, all these states, in spite of their previous unwillingness to join the secession movement, would probably have been impelled by a strong self-interest to range themselves on the side of the other slave states, and the Confederacy would have been strengthened by the addition of at least 4 states. There was an important party among the Confederates from the western Southern states. It was led by Postmaster General John H. Reagan and included General Albert Sidney Johnston, who believed in advancing at the very outset into Kentucky and making the Ohio River the first line of Southern defense. The plan was rejected by Davis and his advisors. It was an unfortunate reaction. The Confederacy was finally beaten because it was flanked in the west and cut in two at Vicksburg. But if Washington had been captured or invested after Bull Run, it is certain that the Confederate line would have been pushed to the Ohio, and it would probably have been held there. The advantage gained by McClellan in West Virginia would have been lost, for he would practically have found himself within the Confederate lines and would have been compelled to withdraw into Pennsylvania. Even as matters were, the position of the Union was highly precarious all through the summer and autumn of 1861. There were signs of a demand for peace in the North. Lincoln's own party was turning against him. The sympathy of Europe was rapidly passing over to the Confederacy. But so long as Lincoln stood firm in the White House and Congress sat at the Capitol, the government at Washington still lived, and the people felt it. The truce so kindly, so inexplicably permitted by Davis and Lee and Johnston, enabled McClellan to organize and drill a great army, to fortify the capital, to spread renewed confidence in the North, and, in short, to establish a fulcrum for future victory. This was not the last time that opportunity knocked at the door of the Confederacy. It knocked again, and loudly, as will be shown in the next chapter, the same year. Either event taken alone appears decisive. For as we contemplate the events of the 21st of July, 1861, it quite appears as if the flag of 2 republics, 3, and conceivably 4, might have been flying over this great American domain today if Johnston had pressed his advance down the Warrenton Turnpike early Monday morning, July 22nd. Wars, divisions, European intrusion, retrogression and darkness would have been America's fate, instead of that imperial advance, with liberty and union, which has dazzled and heartened the whole world. 2. If the Confederate States had purchased the East India Company's fleet in 1861. In the preceding chapter I have noted the disastrous consequences of the rejection of John H. Reagan's plan, urged at Montgomery at the very foundation of the Confederacy, for the prompt occupation of the south bank of the Ohio River as the advanced line of defense, and the equally unfavorable result of the failure of Johnston to press on to the Potomac after the great success at Manassas. Gettysburg was a pivotal combat also, for if Lee had been supported by Stuart's cavalry on that occasion, there is at least a possibility that the war's tide might have been turned then and there. But there was a narrower contingency than either one of these. To a positively decisive extent, the success of the national forces in subjugating the Southern states turned on the sea power. The conquest of the Confederacy was, in fact, a matter of supreme difficulty as it was, and if the South had possessed a respectable navy, and had been able to keep its ports open and steadily exchange its cotton in Europe for the materials and munitions of war, the conquest would not have been possible at all. The chance for the establishment of such a navy lay within the grasp of the Confederate statesmen, and was by them let slip. Neither they nor anyone else at the time realized how easy the thing would have been. It is first necessary to explain in what situation the national government was, at the outset of the war, in the matter of a naval force. Nominally, the United States Navy consisted of 90 vessels, but of those 50 were utterly obsolete and unusable except as supply ships. Of the other 40, 20 were in a state of hopeless unreadiness. Several of the best ships were in the remotest corners of the world. The home squadron was comprised of 12 ships, of which only 7 were steamers. Nearly 50 years after the invention of steam navigation, the United States depended principally upon sailing vessels for its defense. Only 3 trustworthy warships were left in northern waters for the defense of such ports as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. As between the North and the South, the chance to wield the sea power lay within the one of the 2 rival governments, which had first put on the water even a very small fleet of ironclad, steam-driven vessels. The Confederacy proved afterward what power could be exerted in this direction with but one single ironclad, when the Merrimac destroyed or scattered all the ships in Hampton Roads, for a moment threatened Washington and the northern cities with ravage, and was checked at last only by the almost providential appearance of another ironclad, Ericsson's little Monitor, on the scene. And the Alabama's armor of chains made her for a time almost a match for the United States Navy. By what means could the Confederacy have forestalled the North in the provision of a really effective navy? The chance, as I have said, was offered and declined, with fatal want of foresight. It lay in the 10 steamships of the English East India Company, which in 1861 was winding up its affairs. These ships were offered to the Confederacy at a fair valuation. They were very good vessels, and capable of prompt armoring in at least as effective a style as that in which the Alabama was afterwards armored. The East India Company was prepared to make such terms as the Confederate government could have met. British outfitters were perfectly willing to trust the Southern statesmen. The ships could have been armed in a few weeks. There was nothing to prevent their entrance into Southern ports, for the blockade was not made effective until 1 year after the war broke out. The Otero, renamed by the Confederates the Florida, had no difficulty in taking on her men and guns in the Bahamas. Possessed of 10 good steam vessels, commanded by such men as Maury, Moffett of the Florida, and Semmes of the Alabama, the Confederacy could have quickly overcome its lack of mechanics and workshops by importation from Europe. It was the command of the Mississippi, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee rivers which broke the back of the Confederacy. And does anyone imagine that the wooden ships of Farragut could have entered the Mississippi, compelled the abandonment of New Orleans, and secured the possession of not only the seacoast but the inland river waters which commanded the Confederacy from the rear, if there had been any good ships to resist him? The start which these 10 ships would have given a Confederate navy would have more than put the South even with the North on the sea. It must be remembered that up to 1862, even as it was, the South could do better in the courts and exchanges of Europe than the Union could. Why? Because the South had the cotton, upon which the mills of Europe depended. The continued chance to market cotton would have saved the situation for the South. Alabamas in any requisite number would have issued from British shipyards. As it was, several powerful rams were under construction for the Confederacy in 1861 and 1862 in the yards of the Lairds. But the continued insistence of Minister Adams on the unlawfulness of this proceeding, joined with the fact that the Confederates had no recognizable navy to back up their purchases, at last compelled the British government to take these rams over and add them to its own sea power. President Jefferson Davis declined the offer of the East India ships for the apparent reason that the military necessities of the Confederacy pressed hard upon the financial resources of the new government. Every member of his government was quite thoroughly convinced that the national power could not successfully invade the South, provided a strong army were quickly put into the field. The ready material for good soldiers was much more abundant in the South than in the North. Nearly all Southern men were horsemen, hunters, marksmen, out-of-door men. On the other hand, the first levies from the North were mostly city men, unaccustomed to firearms, strangers to exposure, flabby of physique. Manassas amply illustrated the great superiority as soldiers of the first comers from the South over the first comers of the North. The Confederate leaders counted upon making permanent the advantage which they were confident of gaining in the field at the outset. To purchase out of hand 10 steamships, from resources that were yet to be created, and with the manhood of 7 states demanding to be armed, looked indeed like madness. And yet this was the very card which, if played, would have saved the Confederacy's game. Conceive for a moment the Union Navy debarred from entrance into the James or any of the navigable waters of Virginia, to support military operations in the direction of Richmond. Conceive Wilmington, North Carolina, which was an easily defensible port, and which really remained open to the blockade runners for almost 2 years after the beginning of the war, rendered a fairly safe point of departure for European trade throughout the war. Conceive the Mississippi, from Cairo southward to its mouth, continuously under the power of the Confederacy, with a fleet of river gunboats backed up by a Gulf squadron. Does anyone imagine that in that case the North could have made either any warlike or commercial use of the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, or even the Mississippi from Cairo up to St. Louis? Freed from the unceasing coast menace and from the danger of being cut in two along the rivers, the effectiveness of the land forces would have been more than doubled. Leaving out of the account the possibility of offensive operations against Washington and the cities of the North, the defense of the seceded states could have been made so secure that the people of the North would have called loudly for peace. The border slave states would have cast in their lot with the Confederacy, and England and France would have openly sided with the South. Secession would have triumphed definitely before the end of the year 1863. With the English East India Company, it was a case of take our ships or leave them. The South left them, and with them it left its chance for independence, and for putting two mediocre American republics in the place where one great one, after that decisive moment, was bound to stand forever. End of If the Confederates had marched on Washington after Bull Run, and If the Confederates had purchased the East India Company's fleet in 1861. From The Ifs of History, by Joseph Edgar Chamberlin. Recording by James Christopher. jxchristopher@yahoo.com